DevOps mean from maybe a mindset?
I usually preach to my team that automation is the testable version of your documentation, right? I mean, if you're describing what you're doing in terms of setting something up, you say step 1, do this, step 2, do this. The best kind of documentation you can have there is just basically a program or an operation that you can execute, because then you don't have the chance of human error. So automation is absolutely key, and it serves the two purposes of describing what it is that you've done and also being able to execute and test it to make sure that it still works, whether it's still current. So for me, automation is also that thing where you're creating those building blocks of learnings that you can build on top of, right?
Why has your DevOps become so big right now?
With human communication, there's so many more nuances that you have to get right, that using the right verbiage or words even in your coding practice are really, really important. I think most developers can relate to this. Like you look through some source code trying to find a problem and you go, who the hell wrote this? And then you go, annotate, see, look at whatever your blame system is or source control system, and goes, oh, it was me 6 months ago. And just on that basis, you just know, like, if you can write something and you've got good peer review processes, like the chances, like if two of you understand what's going on, the likelihood that your future self will understand this as well is improved, and that becomes really important. So,
what other challenges have presented itself by working remotely as a manager? How have you managed that?
So the biggest challenge is communication. It's amazing how many cues you get from talking in person, visual body language that you no longer get. Even being co-located in one place, you might not always be paying attention to all the conversations going around you, but the amount of things you learn through osmosis through that process is actually quite incredible. So as part of switching to a more remote culture, one of the biggest challenges, how do we simulate those sort of things in a remote environment? So there's been a lot more attention, especially on my part, to try and facilitate those interactions somehow. It's actually quite interesting. So I've always not been a fan of, say, documentation, because documentation is really quickly out of date. And as I said before, my favorite kind of documentation is one that you can run. But being remote suddenly, I'm sort of starting to change my mind on this. This is one of those fundamental things that I've changed my mind on. It's really important now to start writing stuff down so you can share that with somebody and say, hey, when you're free, have a read through this, sort of trying to simulate that I'm talking to somebody about an idea and somebody goes, oh, I was dealing with something like that the other day. I know exactly how to solve that problem. This is my experimentation at the moment, trying to figure out how do we improve on those processes.
Just sharing upon maybe giving engineers like true ownership and little projects and even budgets. Can you just explain a little bit more about that?
As part of sort of the evolution of becoming a manager, you sort of notice, like, you're an engineer, you're learning, you're doing, and then you generally progress to sort of like a management level, and you generally your default is to manage by experience. You tell people how to do things, like I've done that, I've learned these lessons, this is how you solve the problem. The real switch sort of comes when you go, oh, rather than telling people how to do it, is how can you empower them to solve the problem themselves? Because they'll learn it quicker, they'll retain it, and they'll take more ownership. And taking that to the sort of extreme, so if I say, well, I've got a budget, I'm just going to take a part of that budget and go, hey, engineer, you have this much to deliver me the solution. And then that actually switches their thinking, not to just like, oh, I know how to code the solution for this, but then go, oh, wait a second, there's a cost involved. All right. So if I spend all of it on just developing it, I haven't delivered the solution. So I've got to allow budget for deploying this. And that includes a budget for the thing that it runs on. So giving them budget suddenly goes, you have this much money, but that means you need to have this in front of the user delivering value. And by just giving them the ownership for that and the responsibility for that suddenly gets them to trigger. It's like, oh yeah, now I need to think all of these things. And it